Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/WTech. Over 180,000 titles to choose from on your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Washington Tech Policy Podcast, episode number 8.
Moving the needle. Welcome to the Washington Tech Policy Podcast.
Curating communications, media, and tech policy news so you don't have to. News, interviews, everything you need without the axe to grind. It's the Washington Tech Policy Podcast with Joe Miller.
Apple loses in a patent infringement case with the University of Wisconsin. Prison phone rates will top the FCC's agenda this Thursday. And Jason Llorenz is my guest today. Apple is lost in a patent infringement case brought by the University of Wisconsin-Madison. A jury in the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Wisconsin has decided that Apple must pay the University of Wisconsin-Madison $234 million for infringing one of its patents, a microchip Apple uses in several of its devices. But as Reuters reports, the final award is lower than the maximum, which had been set at $400 million. The FCC's October meeting is scheduled to take place this Thursday. On the agenda, a review of the foreign broadcast ownership rules, incentive auctions, video relay service, and new spectrum. But prison phone rates are stealing the show, with the commission expected to vote on a cap for the rates inmates are charged to call home. On Monday, The Hill reported that Brian Oliver, CEO of Global Tellink, one of the largest prison payphone companies, blamed state and local governments for sky-high rates inmates have to pay for phone calls in what Oliver characterized as kickbacks. Mark Zuckerberg posted a blog post last week calling for prison reform. He had visited a coding program, Code 7370, which teaches San Quentin inmates how to code. He wrote, quote, "Making our criminal justice system fairer and more effective is a huge challenge for our country. I'm going to keep learning about this topic, but some things are already clear. We can't jail our way to a just society, and our current system isn't working," end quote. The FCC also made a couple of hires last week, Jessica Almond, who is with HTC, and Edward Smith, who worked for the DC government. Fantasy sports sites DraftKings and FanDuel are under fire on the state and federal levels following an expose in the New York Times about illegal online gambling. Nevada has ordered DraftKings and FanDuel to shut down. The Wall Street Journal reports that the Justice Department and FBI are also investigating the sites. The federal regulation at issue is the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act of 2006, and the law creates an exception for gambling on sites that offer games of skill rather than games of chance. So DraftKings and FanDuel are arguing that they are actually games of skill, not games of chance. Chattanooga, Tennessee is now offering broadband speeds that are 10 gigabits per second, and they will be available to all Chattanooga residents for $299 a month. And it's hundreds of times faster than the federal broadband benchmark, which is 25 megabits per second. Public Knowledge, Common Cause, Consumers Union, and the FCC filed comments to deny the Charter-Time Warner Cable merger, despite Charter's assurances to adhere to net neutrality principles and ease interconnection with over-the-top apps like Netflix. The FCC is now turning its attention on potential improper influences that John Malone may have on the company post-merger. FTC Chair Edith Ramirez spoke at an Internet Association event in Menlo Park last week, where she reiterated her concerns about privacy protection and big data and health information. Also on the privacy front, the Computer and Communications Industry Association, CCIA, which represents Yahoo, Facebook, T-Mobile, and Google, published an open letter last week opposing the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act currently pending in the Senate. The group argues the bill does not adequately protect privacy and could affect innocent third parties. Should the Copyright Office stay within the Library of Congress? Conservative leading groups such as the Hudson Institute favor moving the agency. The Hudson Institute published a paper last week arguing that there are three options: keeping it in the legislative branch, moving it to Commerce, or moving it to the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. EFF and ALA want the Copyright Office to remain within the Library of Congress, but appoint a librarian with better tech credentials. Finally, the Department of Education unveiled last week a new experiment to provide financial aid for high-tech boot camps or massive open online courses, or MOOCs. Students completing the programs can earn a starting salary of $74,000, according to some reports. One program, the Flatiron School, featured in Politico, costs about $15,000. Audible. Audible. Yeah. For you, the listeners of the Washington Tech Policy Podcast, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. You'll be amazed at how much more productive you'll feel after you decide to use Audible to finally get on top of some of that reading you've been struggling to get to. Why not listen in the car, on the metro, walking, during a boring reception where you don't feel like talking to anyone and want to hide for a few minutes? Note, I said boring. A handful of them are actually fun. How about Future Crimes by Mark Goodman? You can download Future Crimes or another audiobook free by trying audible.com. Sign up for your free audiobook and 30-day trial today at audibletrial.com/WTech. That's audibletrial.com/WTech. My guest today is Jason Llorenz, a dear friend, staff member at Rutgers Office of Institutional Diversity and professor in Library and Information Science. Jason is a professor, researcher, and advocate with over a decade of federal and state level policy development, strategic communication, and legal expertise. His research interests focus on digital literacy and universal inclusion in the digital economy, telecommunications and internet policy, the role of digital and social media in the innovation economy. Jason teaches understanding and designing social media and social informatics at Rutgers. Jason's writing appears in the Huffington Post, and he is often sought for comment on the issues facing the digital divide and universal digital inclusion. Jason has been interviewed on this subject by media outlets, including the Washington Post and National Public Radio. A regular speaker, Jason has led discussions on Capitol Hill, in state capitals, and for groups and associations including South by Southwest, the delegation of the European Union, the National Caucus of State Legislators, and National Council of La Raza, as well as the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute, and many others. Jason holds a BA from Cazenovia College and a JD from the State University of New York Buffalo School of Law. He is an advisory board member of the Minority Media, they just changed their name, the Multicultural Media Telecom and Internet Council, and a board member of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute Alumni Association. He's a member of the New York State Bar. Please welcome Mr. Jason Llorenz. Welcome to the show, my friend.
Thanks for having me.
So now you've been teaching at Rutgers for a while now, and for a bit over the last 2 years. You were here in Washington for a little bit as a policymaker. Now you're teaching. Do you like teaching? Is that something how's it going?
I love teaching. Particularly love teaching at the undergraduate level at a research university like Rutgers with some serious resources for the modern professor teaching technology-mediated courses. I've gotten to design a course on social media that looks across the way that social is changing everything from business to education, to every aspect of our economy and our social lives. And also teach courses in social informatics, looking at some of the policy issues and getting students both to take a critical look at the technology and the issues, and also to do some design. Get to teach courses where I have students doing UX design and developing app prototypes that put them in charge of developing tech and addressing a big social issue. It's great, love it.
So, Jason, what are you fired up about right now? Like when you what's keeping you up at night when it comes to diversity, when it comes to communications, when it comes to equity?
Well, if you look at the way that the digital economy is forming out, there's a lot to be concerned about. From an equity and inclusion perspective, we have been talking about broadband adoption for the last decade. We've been looking at the gap in adoption. We know that if you're poor and if you're black or brown, you are far less likely just to have broadband at home. But the unfortunate part of that is that those of us who've been focused on that equity conversation, just that broadband adoption gap, and just kind of doing work on that, studying that, have in some ways missed out on a much, much broader, really dire happening in the digital economy, in which this whole world, this whole ecosystem that we talk about every day, is in many ways becoming more and more cleaved off. And that broadband gap, really, the new digital divide, as you know, and others who follow this, is really becoming one of the most dire economic gaps that we've seen since the Gilded Age. So while we've been focused on, well, do poor kids have computers, or do poor kids have coding skills, or is wireless a good substitute for a home computer? While we've just been trying to figure out those conversations, what we've seen is a world in which the Silicon Valley behemoths, or even the folks that are really making money online, have become ever more concentrated. They're ever more from a very, very small elite group of people, and the rest of us, and particularly Latinos, African Americans, the poor, are the user class. And that's really dangerous, because if we see how quickly aspects of the economy have taken off just over the last 5 years, right? We have the Uber economy with Lyft. We have all these innovators and these disruptors. You have in so many sectors, from Airbnb, and all that means. You have an economy that, yes, is creating more opportunity for people, but is seriously concentrating wealth in a way that I think long-term is going to be really dangerous.
Several Nielsen studies, other studies out there, we see, African Americans, blacks, spending 201 hours and 43 minutes watching traditional TV per month. 13 hours, 25 minutes of time-shifted TV, 13 hours, 18 minutes of video on internet. Hispanics, AM/FM radio, 58 hours, 10 minutes. Just apps on their smartphone, 52 hours, 14 minutes. Game consoles, 9 hours, 5 minutes.
We're super consumers. Super consumers, driving incredible amounts of value to these networks. Those numbers bear out across virtually every aspect of media consumption. You can look at it in terms of value added to Facebook, value added to Twitter, the rapid increase in Instagram. I mean, so much of the technologies really on the edge of this economy are driven by consumption, and really there's a real value being added by Latinos and African Americans, undeniably. And the problem with that is that as super users, we are certainly adding to the cool factor, adding to the value, adding to the insights, adding to the effectiveness of these technologies, but not benefiting from the economics of it. When we talk about this digital divide stuff, or the equity divide, or the wealth divide in tech, I mean, however we want to term it these days, it's not just about making either. I think making is really important, and we have to have more black and brown makers who are piercing the equity divide, going out and getting VC capital, starting up, failing, making millions, selling Facebook. We have to get more people in that pipeline, because it's dismal and it's embarrassingly bad. But I would also say, though, there are a whole lot of creators out there, and we see them on Instagram every day. We see them on Facebook every day, who are creating, but also who are not participating in the strategies that would allow them to build wealth from their creations. And so we have incredibly creative young people putting out content. You see it all over Instagram. You see it all over Facebook. You do see it on YouTube. But I would ask, is there a monetization strategy behind even 10% of that? There's a major, major problem that's stemming from a lack of those skills being embedded in among our communities.
Right, because, I mean, there's so much awesome content out there, but are they making money from it is kind of the key thing. That's kind of the critical question, especially when you look at things like unemployment and really, wanting to make the internet more of a kind of a workaround, the same type of work around that it's been for other groups who and a lot of folks who are creating content, thriving online, they don't really necessarily have a lot of tech expertise either, but they know how to market. And so that marketing
Absolutely.
is going to be a key thing. I mean, you have yogis out there, you have people selling, ebooks about how to plan a family trip to Disney World, and these folks are folks who don't necessarily have computer science background, but they know how to market. And so where are they learning how to market? And how can we make that information more accessible as well, I think is going to be a key part of this. And just talking about the tech sector, Google released their numbers. They've been released. They were the first over the last few years. Facebook released some of their numbers. Intel has released their numbers, and they're all dismal. Some of them have been trying to make inroads. A lot of them are really great at talking the talk. Some of them are working a little harder than others and still not seeing results. What are some of your thoughts on what's going on there? What's happening there? Is there not enough recruitment going on? What do you think is the reason for the fact that no matter what folks seem to do, things seems to be improving diversity in the tech sector?
Yeah. Well, two thoughts there. One is that the numbers tell us that we're actually graduating more computer science graduates than are being hired in Silicon Valley. So that means that there's some other stuff going on. So obviously we have a ways to go in terms of having more black and brown computer science graduates. The numbers are there today that are still not being hired. So something's going on, or something's being missed culturally. The second thing is, I don't think that it comes from a deep place of wanting to freeze folks out. That's not the sense that I get. But I do get the sense, though, that the folks in these in Silicon Valley spaces come from a very limited number of institutions. They come from a limited understanding of what they see as success. There's a culture that they're following, right? This kind of startup culture that just as Bill Gates and Microsoft had done in the 80s and 90s, we're simply going out to build things to make the world better. This is not an insidious culture. But unfortunately, just as diversity as we've had to push for diversity in other industries over the decades, this is a space where diversity is going to necessitate some disruption. It's going to necessitate disruption of culture, necessitate a disruption of the way that recruiting is thought about, that necessitate a disruption in the way that makers, that startups think of value. Traditionally, the Silicon Valley startup has not had to particularly concern themselves with diversity, but in today's world, we know that the market-based forces, the political forces, the folks who are pushing for equity are going to make that a concern. And so as companies like Google, companies like Apple, the startup that is the next Google or next Apple go out to do business in the world with a more and more engaged public and more engaged African-American and Latino intelligentsia, folks that really are both seeing the trends in terms of the market and the usership, but also flexing the political power to say, well, we need to participate in this. The boards are going to be forced to think about diversity, to think about how to include qualified, engaged, insightful candidates in the next time that there's a board opening, and the next time that there's a conversation about how do we develop our own skunk works, how do we put together a fund to go and develop a next generation of startups. Diversity can and should be a part of that conversation, because what we've seen and what we know about the way that value has been created for a very long time is that when you include diversity, when you include the best ideas from all communities, companies actually do better. Companies are more sustainable. companies are more connected to the consumers that are going to drive value for the next 100 years. It's not just a good thing to do. It's really a necessity in order to have a company that's reflective and connected to the markets it serves.
Some say there's too much time spent talking about diversity and that people who feel like they're underrepresented should just set high goals, go for them no matter what. What's your response to this? Business, they say, it's about optimism, picking yourself up. That's what it's like for everyone. So, where do you draw the line between standing up for yourself, when you feel like you've been slighted in the workplace, and just kind of ignoring those slights and going out there and just making it happen no matter what?
Well, that's exactly why I think the conversation about diversity is so important, because if there's not kind of this overarching attention to diversity, right? If there's not the sense that people are paying attention, that the Reverend Jackson is paying attention to diversity numbers, or that the entire community of civil rights and diversity aspects are paying attention to diversity and asking for numbers, and more importantly, asking why the numbers are so bad, and also how they can help. If that conversation is not going on, I think it's much harder for the one or two folks in Google or at Apple or wherever to kind of make it through the ranks and feel like there's a sense of support. So I think that the conversation is important, but it has to be, the conversation can't simply be, so you have 2% diversity and you're bad. Well, no, I don't think it's about that. I think it's about the question mark should be and can be, well, how do we help? What can we do? What are the entry points? At what point can we create programs that can actually help this, or how early do we have to start? If the reality of, and we know this, both of you and I are from New York City. When I was coming up in public schools in New York City, there were development of entry programs. I got to college through the Higher Education Opportunity Program in New York State that created opportunities for people like me who were coming out of not so great neighborhoods, not so great educational environments, maybe where we needed an entry, right, a shift that would change our lives. That changed my life. I'm a lawyer, and I've gone through higher education. I'm teaching. I'm a college professor, right? Maybe we need the same thing. At the end of the day, if you take people who are simply not in the environment for whatever reason, and you introduce them, maybe if you look at where the pipeline is, if it starts in junior high school or high school, college, wherever that is, then that can ultimately result in a diversified pipeline. Simply paying attention to diversity and creating pipelines of diverse people to develop the cultural capital, the connections that ultimately lead to money, and develop the exposure to the best in class in tech in Silicon Valley and in all the other places where innovation is happening. And I think that those things can result in more participation.
And you mentioned other industries where innovation is happening, and it's not like there's no innovation happening in the media industry, right? I mean, these are extremely creative people who write these shows, who perform on them. But there's really a lack of diversity there too. Although you have seen shows like Empire and Scandal take off. Shonda Rhimes and Lee Daniels, their shows have taken off. But what are you seeing in the executive ranks, for example? What's happening in the media sector? Do you think they're kind of? Do you think there's not enough being made now that the focus is squarely on tech? Do you think there's enough emphasis that's still being placed on diversity happening within the media industry?
You look at, for example, Netflix is playing an incredibly large role in production in this country and thereby in the world. If you look at if you ask yourself the question, does Netflix have production partnerships that are reflective of diversity, black, brown, etc.? The answer is no. So that in and of itself is a problem, and that's reflective across virtually all media companies. There are the traditionals, the NBCs, the ABCs, that have been more reflective over the years. You do have Shonda Rhimes, right, who is doing great stuff. You do have Tyler Perry. Oprah Winfrey has been able to crack some of this. There is some production, but ultimately no. And that even in the traditional maker class, in terms of diversity of production, behind the camera, in front of the camera, that this is still an important conversation, and one that needs to be pushed, because as we know, production is kind of an ebb and flow thing, right? Shows come and go, and unless there's an ongoing kind of push to make sure that diversity is a part of the thought process on the production side, then it's not going to happen.
So let's talk about solutions. What do you see that's been actually working out there?
One program that I'll point to is something that my friend Antonio Tijerino at the Hispanic Heritage Foundation is doing, actually going out to Stanford and creating a very early pipeline that includes coding skills, mentorship. It's a program that I think will robustify, if that's a word, but it'll become more robust over the years. and I think if it combines that attention to coding skills ultimately with some real capital behind some startups, I think it could really change the game.
Jason, we're going to make it, my friend. Absolutely.
Well, I know that you're going to, Joe, and I appreciate the work that you're doing in advancing diversity, and I love Washing Tech. I do enjoy the podcast and all the other products that you put out, so I look forward to you and the work that you're doing, and I hope that we get to work together on some of this someday.
You have been listening to Jason Llorenz, who's a senior fellow at Rutgers University. Jason, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave with the audience?
Oh, man, final thoughts. Mark Zuckerberg didn't happen in Harvard, so if we care about this stuff, if we care about a fair, equitable, wealth equitable digital economy, then we really have to start in kindergarten.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, sir.
That concludes episode 8 of the podcast. Thanks so much to all of you for listening and putting up with my shenanigans. I can't do any of this without you, so thank you. If you're new to the podcast, or even if you've been listening for a while, I have a free cheat sheet for all of my new email subscribers, and you can find the sign up for that at washingtech.com/cheat sheet. And that cheat sheet is a guide for you to get up to speed on various different policy areas, including cybersecurity, intellectual property, net neutrality, and other areas. It's a quick reference anytime you're preparing for a meeting or writing something you need citations for. That's washingtech.com/cheat sheet. You'll cut hours off your research. Hours. Thanks again to all of you for listening. I'll see you back here next week for the, let's see if I can do this, Halloween episode. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Washing Tech Policy Podcast. You've been briefed.